Hey everyone, we are continuing our sermon series based on the book of Romans called God's Greater Story. And we're seeing how you and me and our neighbor down the street fit into God's greater story and the good news that comes from that. But I want to start this off right at the beginning with a story. Back in 1961, there was a visitor who walked into an art gallery in Glasgow, and he had a brick in his hand. And he walked in there with determination and found the piece of art that he was looking for. It was Salvador Dali's Christ of St. John on the cross. And he began with the brick to hack at the piece of art and destroy it. The onlookers were noted his anger and violence as he destroyed the work of art. So why was he destroying it? What was going on in him? Did he hate Christ? Did he hate Christians? And he wanted to desecrate this Christian art? No, not really. It was out of a love for Christ himself. You see, he objected to the very way that Salvador Dali portrayed the crucifixion of Jesus. You see, the problem this guy had with it was one of perspective. Because normally, the way we look at pictures of the Jesus on the cross is we are on the world looking up to the cross of Jesus, right? Looking up at Jesus hanging on the cross. Well, Dali kind of turns that around where we're almost standing on top of Jesus, looking down at Jesus on the cross, who is then looking down onto the world below. Dali's portrayal is asking the viewer just for one moment to be situate yourself above the cross and look at the world almost like he's through God's eyes. For the visitor, the guy that destroyed the work of art, this was sacrilegious. He was putting himself above Jesus. And this vision of the world can be hard. It can be difficult for the Christians to see because sometimes it's hard to look at the world around us. Sometimes it's hard to see the good news that is around us. I mean, so often we look at the world around us and we just see nothing but bad, nothing but nothing good. I mean, just look at it. Like, look at turn on the news, right? We see protests going on, there's rioting, there's violence, there's death, there's cancer. We have this virus all around. I'm pre-recording my sermon after all, right? Like, all these things, we look at it and it's like, and I think it's easy for us to look at the cross, to look at Jesus, and we see it almost like an escape. That we see Jesus on the cross and we look up there and it's like, if I can just focus up there enough and see the cross, then I think I could get away. Like I can at least pretend that the world isn't, the box of trouble that it is right now. If I can just see up there, I can leave all this behind. And we think that if we just concentrate on that enough, then finally I'll fly away. Oh Lord, I'll fly away. And I think that's where Dali's crucifixion kind of invites us to look at a different narrative, to look at a different perspective here. That it's not about escaping, but it's looking at the perspective of God, of Jesus on the cross, on the troubles of the world that is around us. And I think that's one of the things that Paul is dealing with in Romans chapter 10, is that it's dealing with these two things. So I think there's two things going on in this section. And that one of them is one that we've been talking a lot about. It's that we are saved by grace, that we haven't done anything to earn it or anything like that. That's the first thing that's going on here. But the second one is we are people that are involved in God's mission. So let's talk about that first one for just a little bit here. And let's look at the painting and see how the painting helps us show this. So I want you to notice how the crucifixion is drawn. I want you to notice the body. I want you to look for this. How is the body on the cross? How is Jesus' body hanging on the cross? Where are the nails? Notice there's no blood. There's nothing really that's holding him on the cross. It's not there. Nothing is forcing him to be on the cross. It's a matter of his choice, and he is there because of his love for you and me. And of course, I know that, that people nailed him to the cross. The Romans did it, and the Jews accused him. And I know that all of their sin throughout the world held him onto the cross, like the great songs say, right? My sin held him there. And I know I would have made all the same choices. I mean, after all, whenever we see someone who is truly exemplifying Christ, we usually get to angry there. But we see that Salvador Dali's painting shows something that he is there willingly. That even in the midst of everyone mocking him, saying that he saved others, can't he save himself? He never took himself off of the place of suffering. Instead, he was there to continue to save us because he loves us. And he was saving us from the struggle of the world, that we would know that God was always on our side. It was pure love that Jesus was on that cross for you and me. And this idea of Jesus saving us by grace and grace alone, we think is like this new idea. After all, it seems like it really comes from the New Testament. And we're like, oh, it's the new one. And that's the new covenant, and God is now saving us by grace. It was all law before and all that, and God was harsh. Then for some reason, his mind changed with Jesus, and he's so nice now and just giving away things and all that. Like, no. Like, I don't think that's true. I mean, we actually see a graceful account of God kind of in the book of Deuteronomy. In fact, in Romans chapter 10, Paul is talking about how grace has saved you by faith, and that and he's quoting all of these Old Testament passages about how you have been saved by grace and faith. If I went through all of them, most of them are in Deuteronomy, Psalms, and Isaiah. And if I went through all of them, this sermon would be like terribly long. And one of these is Deuteronomy. And remember what happened around in Deuteronomy and Exodus. Like, the people were wandering around in the wilderness for like 40 years. And when they were wandering around in the wilderness, were they the best people? Like, they were the ones that God was like, yeah, there they are. They're just obedient. Like, they never created an idol to another god built out of their golden wealth. Like, no. They didn't do that at all. Like, they never, ever grumbled at everything. They never disobeyed. They never wanted to go back into slavery for any reason. No, that stuff never happened, right? Yeah. And yet God is bringing them into the land, and he wants them to know something. And we can see this from Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 4. And I got the book right here, right? It says this: do not say in your heart, after the Lord your God has thrust them out before you. Remember all the people that were in the promised land. He was bringing them into the promised land. So do not say in your heart, as I got rid of them all for you, it's because of my righteousness and amazingness that the Lord has brought me to possess the land. You see the cheeky nature of it? Don't say it's because of your righteousness that he brought you into the land. He goes, in verse 6, if we skip down, he says basically the same thing. Know therefore that the Lord your God is not giving you this good land to possess because of your righteousness, because you are extremely stubborn. Like he's like, it's a gift from God. It's a gift from God that's going into the land. It's because they have been stubborn. So don't ever think it's because of your righteousness. And I think that's amazing, because we get just a few years down and they think that they are there because they are so righteous. And this is what Paul is talking about. Even when he starts talking about this in his verse. So this is verse 9 of chapter 10 of Romans. And he says, because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. So it's not because that you were inherently righteous that God gave you the salvation or the promised land or paradise or whatever you want to call it. It's that the Lord is your Lord, and you know that you can rest in him and have faith in him and that he will save you. That's good news. That's news to get excited about. And Paul is trying to transfer that onto you, that Jesus is saving you because he loves you and he wants you, and he doesn't want you to have guilt or burdens or any of that. Yes, there's going to be struggle, just like Jesus found crosses, but God will lead you through it no matter what may happen, even in this world that looks scary sometimes. It's exciting, good news, and it's an exciting way to see the mercy of Jesus. And this moves us into that next point that said that we are involved in God's mission. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Emphasis on everyone, not just the good Jews, not just the good Roman Gentiles, but everybody. Even the neighbor that you don't like that mows his lawn at 10 o'clock or mows his lawn at 7 o'clock a.m. Awful person, right? For Paul, the mission isn't just Jesus just hanging around, floating up in the sky, kind of supervising over everything, going, oh, I'm going to take you out someday. Like he's not doing that. Like, no, for the author of Romans, for Paul, the mission is God coming down to earth, to getting in the midst of our mess and dirty, and he uses the very things that often bring us down. He uses our mouths to bring good news. Listen to how Paul says this, and it's a little convoluted, but listen to it. It's chapter 10, verse 14. How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him whom they have not heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach or bring good news. How beautiful are the ones who bring good news. How beautiful are just the normal everyday people who bring good news. And honestly, good news, telling someone that God is for them, that he will save them, that he is part of them, that they do not have to worry an eternal worry, that he has them in the palm of his hand and loves them. God is using just normal people to proclaim to a world filled with sin, death, hurting, and pandemics, and viruses, and rioting, and discord between, and terrible politicians. He's using just normal people to bring the good news. And Dali's painting here shows us even more about the work of God. So you remember the painting, right? Remember we saw the first part of the sermon here today, that nothing was really holding him on to the cross, that he was there of his own, right? He was making that choice. But now when we look at the painting and we're looking down, we see from God's perspective the world underneath him. And we can see the world, and it kind of turns into a lake. And what do we see at the end of that lake? We see two fishermen. We see that the love of God that was shown to us on the cross extends into the entire world, into the very edges of the world, all the way to the average Joes that are fishing. But we know as Christians that it's not just fishermen, right? that it's the disciples, but the disciples are such a great microcosm, and they show this so well because they're not bright dudes. They're not. They're just average guys. These are just average fishermen. These are not scholars. These are not the Pharisees. These are not people like me who know a thing or two about Greek or Hebrew or the English language, barely anything about the English language. Like it's not like, it's just average people, and that God sets them aside and does something special through them. And that's how God always works. We see this constantly in the ministry of Jesus, that he invites the normal men and women into followers of him and blesses and sends them out. That's what Pentecost is all about, that the Spirit of God just suddenly descends onto them and sends them out into the rest of the world. Why in the world would God use just normal people like this? Well, maybe because using normal people is just the way God does things. Frankly, to me, it kind of seems like just handing a child some paints and going, "Hey, Brennan, why don't you paint the Sistine Chapel? Let's see how that goes," right? But that's how God works. That he uses the foolishness of everyday people to confound the wise. God's work doesn't come from extreme eloquence, but it comes from everyday normies giving the good news away. Not giving just the correct answers, but giving the good news away. That God loves them, that they love their neighbors. And it's helpful for us to remember those two things that we talked about today and how our perspective changes. Yeah, sure, we are in worship today, whether we're at home watching this on the screen or actually in the worship service today. And we look up at the Jesus who saved us, who loved us so much, who willingly was up there. But something happens when we turn around and we walk outside of the doors and we go outside, our perspective changes. Because I think the painting by Salvador Dali invites us to look at the world the way God sees it. That God just doesn't remain up in the high places, but God comes down. And we see that constantly, that God comes down. After all, when his people were wandering in the wilderness, God didn't just leave them to wander. He came down and he built a tabernacle with them, and his glory filled the tabernacle. When his people were a nation in the promised land, they built a temple, and he came down and he rested. He was Emmanuel inside and filled the glory. His glory filled with the temple there. And when Jesus came, Jesus at the very beginning of the story went to John the Baptist, and John baptized him. And we saw that it wasn't God high and lofty looking down. It's like, "Well done," like all that stuff. No, God came down and filled him up. God comes down and he made him Emmanuel, which means God with us. And we see in Pentecost that God comes down to each and every one of us and indwells in us. His Spirit makes us a tabernacle, makes us a temple, fills us with the same Spirit that indwelled with Jesus himself. That God comes down to us, and that means that the presence of God comes down and is where we are, wherever we are. He's right here with us today, and he'll be with us when we go to Publix a little bit from now, right? He is always with us. So when we go out from here, we remember that our perspective changes, and hopefully we have his eyes, that we can see the world like he does, where he looks at him through the love of Jesus on the cross. And when he looks at the world, he doesn't see the mess that we think that we are all in, that's just irredeemable. He sees a place that is filled with his glory. He loves this place too much to just see all the mess all around. Through the cross of Jesus Christ, God looks at the world and he sees nothing but good news. He sees constantly new creation breaking in. He sees the dead being made alive in Christ, and he sees the light shining into dark places. After all, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. How beautiful are you guys as you bring it yourself? Have a great Sunday.